David, what was the first sign that you heard of or you saw where it seemed like it wasn't quite going right for Potter at Chelsea?
Well, the external dissatisfaction had been building. And by external, I mean people outside the inner sanctum. So you're talking supporters, media, commentators. There was clearly, despite a really quite impressive unbeaten start to his reign, perhaps a sense that he wasn't a great fit from early on. Certain things, whether it be his communication in press conferences, the players not taking to his style, his ability to handle all of these new signings in January, which really I feel was a bit of a poison chalice. I'm not sure any manager could have dealt in this time frame too much better, but this is a results industry. But then it came to a crunch you felt around the time of Tottenham away, which was really just an insipid performance. And there were legitimate questions then being asked of his team selection, his judgment, the decision to play Hakim Ziyech from the start, just a very short time after his move or proposed move to PSG had collapsed. That definitely raised eyebrows. Potter's inability to get a tune out of Chelsea in such an important match against such fierce rivals. And that really put his head on the block going into the games against Leeds and Borussia Dortmund. Of course, there was the terrible Southampton result in and amongst that as well. And Leeds and Dortmund were make or break. He won them both. He then produced a really good performance against Leicester to give himself a stay of execution. But when a hierarchy has had these doubts, especially a hierarchy that was seeing him as an appointment for the long term, and that they wanted and intended to judge him in years, not weeks, months, or games, and they wanted to see progress, that sense that doubts are already keeping in should set alarm. That sense that doubts are already creeping in should set alarm bells ringing. And that's when I just started to feel that both externally and now internally, if he didn't continue that upward trajectory, it would become harder each time to recover. And Everton, I think, was a devastating blow. That late goal, I don't think much was made of it. As much was made of it as you might expect because of that winning run just before and because of the international break straight afterwards. But then when you come back and lose to Aston Villa 2-0, I think it would have been a bigger surprise to the majority of people by this point, with, as we detail in the long read on The Athletic, open mutiny by this point within Stamford Bridge, coming from the stands, chance of you don't know what you're doing. It was game over. And I don't think that came as a massive surprise. It was more that the ownership that had placed so much faith in him, given him a 5-year contract, and had said all the right things despite all the noise and pressure they were facing, had buckled and decided to pull the plug.
Simon, the Chelsea dressing room over the years has been a very strong one. There's been some very influential figures in there who a few years ago had the ear of Roman Abramovich more so than the managers, it seemed like. This dressing room is different, undoubtedly. But when you go through some of the detail in the piece that you and David have written, the backstory of how it's gone wrong for Graham Potter on The Athletic, there are some interesting details that felt like they built during Potter's time about the players' doubts about their manager.
Yeah, and to be honest, it wasn't like open mutiny. It wasn't like downing tools or anything like that. It's just when you're players who've, of course, played under top managers, who've won things, that you've won big prizes, the difference. So as much as from what we're sort of saying that the players liked him as a person, it still led to, there were still doubts about whether he was cut out for the job. Hence why we talk about as you've already mentioned, the nickname of Harry and Hogwarts. Not very imaginative.
I wonder how they came up with it.
Yeah. Didn't take, well, footballers, sometimes aren't known perhaps for the subtlety of their banter sometimes. But even things like, of course, one of the things that Graham Potter that was unusual for him was going in a fans forum and dropping the F-bomb.
Yeah.
That sparked a lot of, well, we've never heard him swear before, and where's that come from? And this is off the back of a few wins. That sort of raised sort of eyebrows.
I thought it was really interesting, that line as well, that the players had never heard him swear. Now, I know there's completely different types of managerial styles and different ways even to be people, but that shocked me in a dressing room environment.
Yeah, because you picture a manager at halftime, don't you? You know, the classic sort of hairdryer treatment, the throwing of teacups across the room, all that. But that was also what you were hearing, that he and this is not a criticism, this is his style, and he often said that I can't be something I'm not, and he's right to do things his way. But you can imagine if someone comes in and says the same thing: keep going, lads, you're doing well, this is good, it will come. You hear that once, you go, okay. You hear that twice, okay. When it's every single time, the message is clearly going to be, it diminishes in its meaning, and people start to think, are you really cut out for this job? And you know, it's like I said, I hasten to add, it's not like he lost the dressing room like you would describe previous Chelsea managers losing the dressing room, but let's just say they didn't have the belief in him, and I think that is just as important, particularly when you're playing at such a high level under such scrutiny.
Yeah, and I think that we need to be fair in this and say that Graham Potter has got to shoulder some blame. I think he would accept that himself. There were a number of selection decisions that you can call into question. We detail how, he asked words to the effect of, what do the players think of me? And that belied a lack of confidence. And when a manager at a club like this, any club really, but especially at such a high level where the expectations are to win trophies, and that's a relic of the Roman Abramovich era, then the hierarchy will detect and pick up on that. Any sign of weakness you show explicitly to the outside world in your press conference, if you're not exuding the belief that they feel a Chelsea manager should, then they will start to have their own doubts. And I think you need to also flip it over and have a look at the ownership too. I think it's fair to scrutinise them. It has been a relatively short period of time that they've been at the helm, and I'm sure we'll go on to talk about them a little bit more. But from the outside, there's a perception of chaos in terms of the transfer windows have been extremely busy. 2 changes of managers in 10 months, huge amounts of money spent, vast number of injuries, vast number of young players, too many players in the squad, contract situations bubbling, most notably Mason Mount, but also N'Golo Kante hasn't signed his new deal, a raft of players who will be out of contract as things stand a year later and in 2025 beyond that. They've been very public, the ownership. You've seen them on the side of the pitch being photographed a lot. Todd Boehly, on camera, sort of commenting on results that go viral on social media. They've been very visible.
They've heard the owner swear now as well. Yeah,
they've heard the owner swear too, and there are many in the industry that at the moment the jury is out on the evidence that they've seen so far on this ownership, or at least questions are being asked if they know what they're doing, if they've made the right appointments, the quality of their decisions, the way that Pierre-Emerick Aubameyang was recruited from Barcelona and then hasn't played a prominent role in the slightest. He doesn't even get in match day squads at the moment. Was Noni Madueke needed? Where is the central striker when you've brought in all these defenders and midfielders and wide players? Why is Benoit Badiashile not used more? And some of that will fall at the feet of Graham Potter, no doubt, selection. And we are assured that the owners didn't have an overbearing influence on team selection or on the transfer market. But, they've appointed all of these executives. They've now got Lawrence Stewart and Paul Winstanley as co-sporting directors who are leading the football project. They've got Christopher Vivell and Joe Shields in there in high-powered roles as well. we hear that the owners intend in time to sort of step back somewhat, because at the beginning they didn't have these people in position, so they kind of had to do it themselves. And Todd Bowley and Bedad Iqbali have rolled their sleeves up and got their hands dirty in an industry that they know very little about in terms of experience. So I think this is still an embryonic project. And one thing that this Chelsea ownership has learned is that when they switched over from Tuchel to Potter, that action was instigated in what we're told around 12 hours from sacking to appointment, even though they had trailed Potter for a long time. They're going to take longer this time. They're saying it's going to be a thorough, exhaustive, diligent process that instead of sort of hours to days is more like going to be days to weeks, and they're going to hold numerous conversations. They've got to get this right. And before we switch on, because Ian, the word dressing room came into my head when you said it a short time ago, people should read this piece because it gives inside information on exactly how difficult it was for Potter to manage the squad numbers. We've got stories about the likes of Mudryk, this €100 million package signing from Shakhtar Donetsk, and Noni Madueke, also in his own right, a high-profile signing from PSV Eindhoven, having to get changed outside of the dressing room in like a corridor area on a sofa or a bench because there simply wasn't enough space in the first-team dressing room. You can't kick people out of their places who have got lockers, and so you have to get changed somewhere. Also, in meetings that were held by Graham Potter, there wasn't enough space. They had players sitting on the floor. There was a match that took place, I think, last week in training, 11v11 on one pitch and 9v9 on the other. And if that happened at most clubs, it would be maybe first-team players on the 11v11, even with some young players drafted in from the academy. And if there was an overspill match, it would be reserve players, more youth players. This consisted of 100% first-team players at Chelsea. And that underlines how complicated, difficult this was for Graham Potter. And it's going to be something that the current coaching staff on an interim basis and then the next head coach on a permanent basis will have to deal with, although you do imagine there'll be some significant squad alterations in the summer transfer window.
One of the things that really stood out for me was just from the players' perspective, rightly or wrongly, they saw the constant presence of the ownership as a sort of almost big brother watching over Graham Potter 24/7, and whether that allowed him to sort of have his freedom to function. You can imagine anyone in their workplace, if the boss is constantly over your shoulder, what an intimidating sort of feeling that would be. But also David touched on it before, and this has been refuted, but whether it's true or not, the players felt, or some of the players certainly felt, that there was an influence on team selection going on, that possibly they were suggesting who should play in certain games, that, for example, Pierre-Emerick Aubameyang, there's a little line in there that suggests that not only was he a high base salary, but that every appearance he makes, it's a high appearance fee, and that is why he wasn't in the team. But if you're a player that wants a top striker to try and win games, you've got one of Europe's all-time great goal scorers, no matter sort of his form this season. But you've got a guy who's got an amazing record of scoring goals, and he's not even in the squad. That's going to raise questions. But like I said, Chelsea will deny, and the ownership will certainly sort of say that no, this is a sign of their passion, that it wasn't a negative influence. But if the players are feeling that is inevitably going to have a bit of a negative consequence on how they're viewing the situation.